All right, so let's move on to getting too hot. So conversely now, if your temperature rises too high, right, above our standard 98.6 degrees for too long, you become hyperthermic. So this is the opposite of being hypothermic. Essentially, the amount of heat absorbed in your body is greater than the amount of heat you're able to shed. So your body begins to overheat. You actually will stop sweating at this point, which is not good. This is how we cool our body using thermal regulation. So perspiration, for example, goes onto your skin, it evaporates. Remember those principles? That's one of the ways we cool ourselves. So this can make an already dangerous situation even worse. So here's a few different conditions that encompass overheating. Number one, this is the beginning of heat exhaustion and heat stroke, but the very beginning stages. So you might feel a little bit of a dizziness in hot weather if you're not used to it. If you're out for a little while, and you haven't maybe had enough water, your core is just beginning to heat up slightly. You may feel a little bit faint, right? This is not a problem so far. Drink a little bit of water, put your legs up to help with circulation, cool down somewhere, get into a cool place. Now, you'll begin to have heat cramps and things going into sort of this middle stage right here. You may feel this in your muscles, in your stomach, starting kind of in your extremities, your arms and legs. This can happen in hard work or exercise, or if I'm just walking from point A to point B in extremely high temperatures. So these cramps are a sign that I'm too hot. They're also a sign that I'm losing fluids at a dangerous rate. So you need to find a way quickly to cool down and to rest. You need to replenish those fluids as quickly as possible. Avoid things that have alcohol and caffeine in them. Caffeine, being a stimulant, is not really conducive to reversing these effects. And of course, we talked about alcohol in the cold. That really doesn't help with circulation either. This is generally with a prolonged core temperature up to about 100 Fahrenheit. Now, heat exhaustion or heat stroke is a warming of your body where you can't keep yourself cool any longer. You definitely will feel a little bit thirsty, maybe even dizzy and weak. In the kind of more later stages here, you start to feel quite sick, and you're unable to process the way you could thoughts, and you'll probably have much more heat cramping, horrible headaches after a couple of hours. These are in the 100 and 100 to 2 prolonged core temperature areas. Heat stroke starts at about 102. Anything above 106, you're looking at that person probably expiring. There's a little note here. See also discussion of dehydration and the essentials, water, and the important section of hygiene in the portions of this book too. Okay, so back to shelter itself here, now that we understand hot and cold. What is our primary shelter? What does that really mean? So many people think of shelter in terms of a structure. However, shelter really can come in many forms. In some cases, a simple microclimate, like we were talking about, will do just fine. So dressing properly for the elements really can't be overstated at all. Therefore, your first form of shelter probably should be considered the clothes you're wearing, maybe what you have with you. So this can also be expanded to things like additional layers, blankets that you may have, for example, if you have one in your vehicle. A debris shelter in the woods or your home in the city, they're all essentially the same thing, right? They're doing the same thing. They're maintaining your core temperature. So having the right clothes on is really going to do that, whether it's hot or cold, right? So there's much your clothing can do to maintain your core temperature and save your life. not the least of which is to trap body heat and insulate. So layers are really an important concept of this in a survival or disaster situation. The ability to add and subtract layers depending on your conditions and the amount of heat you're generating or that's around you really is vital. So you want to, it's all about conservation. Everything in this book is about conserving what you have, whether it be the heat in your body, the food, the water, etc. So it may be 20 degrees out, but if you're chopping wood, you're hot, right? You start to sweat. Well, being sweaty and wet in a cold environment is as bad as it can possibly get. Shed those layers, let that stuff evaporate, and then you can put those layers back on and warm back up. Really quite a simple concept, but again, we're going back to those 4 super basic principles of thermodynamics. And then, of course, in the opposite, this is why desert dwellers often don't remove all their layers of clothing from their heads and their body. In some cases, they choose really lightweight, light-colored fabrics that don't necessarily trap in a lot of heat, but will retain the sweat and the moisture next to their skin and aid with evaporative cooling. Also, in desert environments where it's windy, that's just going to suck the moisture right out of you too. So if you don't have enough water, this really is going to be a life-saving technique. A good way to cool, of course, is to drink water very evenly to maintain your hydration. If you're near a water source and don't have a way to take it with you, you probably have no choice but to fill up as much as possible. But it's best to try not to gorge and waste it all through urination. So when you drink too much at once, there's a trigger in your body that will cause you to urinate, whether it's time or not, whether it's fully processed through you. So the faster that goes through, the less that is absorbed into your intestines and goes into your body. So here's a few ways to maintain heat or cool through the use of your clothing. So choose layering of lighter fabrics rather than one heavy fabric item. So allow for a flexible system. In hot, arid climates, choose light, thin fabrics like linen, for example. In cold areas, choose wool. There's a number of different types of wool outdoor clothing. If you think those old wool sweaters or something out of a Hemingway picture, that's not how it is anymore. Merino wool is an excellent choice now, and it insulates just like the old rag wool will. Choose base layer fabric. So these are next to the skin, and you want synthetic ones really versus cotton. Synthetics like nylon are performance oriented. They're lightweight, they're moisture wicking too. So, these will actually carry the moisture away from you and let it evaporate instead of getting you all sweaty. There's all sorts of combination synthetics too that have merino wool into them that'll keep you warm. Great stuff. Wear gloves and good wool socks. Keeping your extremities warm, that's going to help the blood stay warmer when it goes all the way to those farthest parts and comes back, right? So that's going to go a long way over time, keeping your core temperature up and keeping your extremities from getting frostbitten. Wear some sort of a hat if you can. In the cold, obviously, you want a wool cap. In the sun or the heat, you want some other type of lighter hat that is maybe breathable, but something with a little bit of a brim maybe to keep the direct sun off of you. Obviously, the opposite will be true, depending on where you are, right? Avoid cotton as much as possible. Avoid heavy type fabrics that will stay wet, like denim. Don't go to bed with moist clothing in cold conditions. It will absolutely hasten hypothermia. Try to change your socks if you can into dry socks. You'll lose a lot of heat through your feet with wet socks. In an environment with lots of rain or wet snow, a thin, breathable, waterproof shell is a great addition too, over a couple of different layers, obviously. If you can, use down or synthetic down as an insulating layer. Down will not insulate when it's wet. Synthetic down alternatives will. You see here on this chart some different fabric types and sort of how well they perform in different types of weather, and then some ratings versus how well they moisture wick, how quick they dry, how comfortable they are, and of course cost as well. I threw in down here too an exercise. So test your cold and foul weather clothing. Don't just buy stuff and stick it in a bin waiting for a disaster. You need to go out and try this just like any other piece of gear. So figure out which layers make the most sense. Know the limitations of those layers. How warm or cool will I be in these clothes? You need to know this stuff before it comes time to use it. Just like a fire starter, just like a sleeping bag. So here's a little graphic on layers and insulation and how they relate to each other. So essentially your body heat on the right goes into the first couple of layers, your base layer, your insulation layer. Then you may have an outer layer or a shell, sort of depending on how hot or cold things are, right? In really warm conditions, there might only be one layer there. In extreme cold, you probably have all four of those, right? You want the perspiration to come out and wick away. You want the heat to be either absorbed and maintained, or even possibly reflect back to the body. Same thing with the cold on the left side. You want the cold to stay out. In the worst scenarios, maybe only penetrate the first couple of layers. That way, right in the middle there, you have a nice clear division between the heat in your body and the cold from the outside. So the conservation of heat or cooling and creation of a microclimate philosophy can be applied to any shelter. So for example, you wouldn't make an enormous shelter somewhere in the boreal forest that really didn't do anything to keep you warm at night. Similarly, why would you try to heat your whole house, right? Rather than everyone maybe staying in one or two rooms during a disaster or an emergency. The idea here is to conserve the heat or the cool. So start thinking in terms of conservation. In the Utah Canyonlands, for example, the temperature during the summer days is really scorching but gets down into the 40s at night. So you wouldn't build your shelter in the middle of a sun-baked pan somewhere, and you probably wouldn't build it down in a slot canyon either that doesn't get any sun. Instead, we would choose maybe to build a shelter against a large rock or a canyon wall, something that would provide us some shade during the day, but also radiate some heat at night. So we're using all these thermodynamic principles around us in our shelter, in our layers, etc., keeping us off the ground. Okay, there's other benefits of shelter too. So continuing on with the philosophy of the shelter itself. Sleep is something we don't maybe always think about when it comes to the shelter or our immediate climate. But it's really important. The secondary purpose of the shelter is to provide you with a place to sleep. So you and those around you will need to be alert during times of a worst case situation. So if you're awaiting rescue, if you're hunting, etc., it's going to need your fullest attention. If you're in a safe situation which doesn't require you and others to sleep in shifts, it's best to stay awake during the day and sleep only at night. Resist taking naps if you possibly can. Sometimes that just isn't the case. You're up at night, you're feeding the fire, whatever, you're not able to get a whole lot of sleep, and you absolutely will be sleeping during the day. But as a best practice, you for sure want to sleep at night and stay up during the day. Stay busy, stay tasking, leave yourself tired when it comes to the night. You want time to dream when you're sleeping and get all the way into REM sleep so you're rested, so you're alert and aware. Sleep deprivation can manifest itself in a lot of different ways. Fatigue, irritability, you can be confused. It will affect your decision making. You can be week, right? So at some point, if you do find yourself needing to sleep during the day and catch up and refresh your body, do it in short segments as much as possible. Avoid a pattern of napping during the day, day after day after day. You will fall into that physically. The exception might be if I'm in an extremely hot environment where I am going to reverse things quite purposely and try to walk out or travel by night. The American Academy of Sleep Medicine says 20% of adults fail to get enough sleep. That's right now. That's not in an earthquake or a terrorist attack or some sort of pandemic, right? That's right now. So usually REM sleep happens about 90 minutes after you fall asleep. The first period of REM, typically around 10 minutes long. And each subsequent REM stage gets a little longer, and then the final one can last up to about an hour. And I talk here a little more about REM sleep, but you can see by this chart, this is how much sleep is recommended people get. Yes, you can live with less, absolutely. But if you can at all help your condition, why wouldn't you, right? And keep in mind, kids are going to have to sleep even more.